let you go, never gonna say goodbye, no.
Authored by Stephen Cohen via TheNation.com, Russiagate allegations of Kremlin attempts to undermine American democracy made themselves zero confidence in those institutions. Ever since Russiagate allegations began to appear more than 2 years ago, their core narrative has revolved around purported Kremlin attempts to interfere in the 2016 U.S. presidential election on behalf of then-candidate Donald Trump. In recent months, a number of leading American media outlets have taken that argument even further, suggesting that Putin's Kremlin actually put Trump in the White House and now is similarly trying to affect the November 6 midterm election, particularly House contests, on behalf of Trump and the Republican Party. According to a Page One New York Times report, for example, Putin's agents are engaging in an elaborate campaign of information warfare to interfere with the American midterm elections. Despite well-documented articles by Gareth Porter and Aaron Maid effectively dismantling these allegations about 2016 and 2018, the mainstream media continue to promote them. The occasionally acknowledged lack of public evidence is sometimes cited as itself evidence of a deep Russian conspiracy, of the Kremlin's arsenal of disruption capabilities, to sow havoc on election day. See the examples cited by Alan MacLeod at fair.org. Lost in these reckless allegations is the long-term damage they may themselves do to American democracy. Even though still unproven, charges that the Kremlin put Trump in the White House have cast a large shadow of illegitimacy over his presidency and thus over the institution of the presidency itself. Consider the following possibilities. This is unlikely to end entirely with Trump. If the Kremlin had the power to affect the outcome of one presidential election, why not another one, whether won by a Republican or a Democrat? The 2016 presidential election was the first time such an allegation became widespread in American political history. Now the same shadow looms over the November 6 elections and thus over the next Congress. But it may not be the last. If so, in barely 2 years, the legitimacy of two fundamental institutions of American representative democracy will have been challenged, also for the first time in history. And if U.S. elections are really so vulnerable to Russian meddling, what does this say about faith in American elections more generally? How many losing candidates on November 6 will resist blaming the Kremlin, 2 years after the last presidential election? We know from critical reporting and from recent opinion surveys that the origins and continuing fixation on the Russiagate scandal since 2016 have been primarily a product of U.S. political intelligence media elites. Hillary Clinton and her adamant supporters still have not been able to do so. Thus a Gallup poll recently showed that 57% of those surveyed wanted improved relations with Russia. It did not spring from the American people, from voters themselves. And other surveys have shown that Russiagate is scarcely an issue at all for likely voters on November 6. Nonetheless, it remains a front-page issue for U.S. elites. Indeed, Russiagate has revealed the lowest esteem that many U.S. political media elites have for American voters, for their ability to make discerning, rational electoral decisions, which is the bedrock assumption of representative democracy. It is worth noting that this disdain for rank-and-file citizens echoes a long-standing attitude of the Russian political intelligentsia, as recently expressed in the argument by a prominent Moscow policy intellectual that Russian authoritarianism springs not from the nation's elites but from the genetic code of its people. U.S. elites seem to have a similar skepticism about, or contempt for, American voters' capacity to make discerning electoral choices. Presumably this is a factor behind the current proliferation of programs, official, corporate, and private, to introduce elements of censorship in the nation's media space in order to filter out Kremlin propaganda. Here, it also seems, elites will decide what constitutes such propaganda. The Washington Post recently gave such an example, portraying Russian and Syrian government forces favorably as they battle terrorists in what U.S. officials for years have portrayed as a legitimate uprising against the authoritarian government of President Bashar al-Assad. That is, thinking that the forces of Putin and Assad were fighting terrorists. Officials for years have been saying. Even if closer to the truth, is Kremlin propaganda because it is at variance with what US. This was the guiding principle of Soviet censorship as well. If the American electoral process, presidency, legislature, and voter cannot be fully trusted, what is left of American democracy? Admittedly, this is still only a trend, a foreboding, but one with no end in sight. But they best recall the discovery of Walt Kelly's legendary cartoon figure Pogo, "We have met the enemy and he is us." If it portends the undermining of American democracy, our elites will blame the Kremlin.